the 2021 SRSA Fellows Address with Steve Deller. And before we start, I'd like to recognize our sponsors for the program. And that's IMPLAN, West Virginia RRI, Regional Research Institute, the Council for Community and Economic Research, C2ER, and the College of Charleston. And Tessa Conroy is going to introduce Steve Deller. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Deller for this year, for his Fellows Address as this year's Fellow of the Southern Regional Science Association. Steve is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. His accomplishments and contributions to the field are beyond measure, but I want to hit a few highlights. He is a former president of SRSA and regular presence at our annual conference. Steve is a recipient of the Walter Eisert Award for Distinguished Scholarly Achievement in Regional Science from the North American Regional Science Association, and most recently, the Rural Renewal Research Prize from the Rural Renewal Initiative. He is a prolific scholar, the author of over 100 journal articles, more than 30 book chapters, and a textbook on community economic development, together bringing him over 7,500 citations. Steve also excels at integrating his applied research with outreach. As an extension economist, Steve can hardly enter a room in Wisconsin without being recognized. A testament to his local presence, engagement, and the years he'll tell you he spent chasing his hubcap around the state in service to rural communities. He is a sought-after partner and respected expert, not just by his peers in the discipline, but also by community members and local leaders. Steve's career is certain to be influential, and his work has already made an impression. I can remember several years ago at a conference, Steve and I were at a session listening to a PhD student present his research. Afterwards, Steve went up to the student to talk about the paper, offer some comments, and he started by introducing himself. Hi, I'm Steve Deller. And before he could get any further, the student sort of jumped back and his jaw dropped and he said, "You're Steve Deller?" Apparently, the student did not anticipate meeting such a famed regional scientist that day. And Steve, judging by his surprise at this reaction, didn't anticipate meeting such a big fan. Having worked with Steve for most of the last decade, I can tell you that's exactly how he is, every bit as collegial as he is accomplished. It's hard to find a better mentor and colleague. He is generous with both advice and coffee. He's full of ideas. His whiteboard is overflowing with papers, projects, and research questions. He is genuinely curious and always willing to collaborate and incredibly good-natured. Steve, it's a privilege to work with you and be learning from one of the best. To all of you in the audience, even though we can't hear or see you, please join me in welcoming Steve this morning with some virtual claps and snaps.
Thank you very much. That was very kind of you. Let me pull my presentation up, and you should be seeing my title screen now. If you're not, please let me know. Before I get started on this, I want to say that the Southern Regional Science Association has always been kind of a home away from home. It is one of the most collegial and fun-natured group that I have been involved with, and I always look forward to these meetings, and thank you very much. In terms of putting this presentation together, I want to thank some conversations that I've been having with Judy Stallman and Tessa and Heather Stevens. Judy and Tessa really kind of challenged me on a couple of these ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you. So any of the good ideas are probably influenced by Judy, Tessa, and Heather, and of course the mistakes are mine and mine alone. What I want to talk about is kind of what I'm seeing through my lens as an extension specialist, as an economic development extension specialist, over working in Wisconsin for, I'm not going to say how many years, but I've noticed a change. I've noticed kind of a shift in attitudes of economic development practitioners around the state of Wisconsin and policymakers, elected policymakers. And I want to kind of talk about that transition and how that transition is occurring. In the US, we have a long tradition of trying to influence state and local economic growth. All the way back to 1791, New Jersey was offering tax incentives to Alexander Hamilton to bring in a manufacturing plant. The famed Erie Canal was basically justified as an economic development strategy. And in 1884, the state of Pennsylvania had invested over $100 million trying to promote businesses to move into and operate and expand in the state of Pennsylvania. It was also a lot of these initiatives that a lot of states got in trouble. There was 120, 130, 140 years ago, there were a number of states and cities that were entering bankruptcy, financial crisis. And it's because many times they overinvested in economic development. One of the things when you think about economic development and you see it in the mainstream media, a lot of times what you see are these big ticket items. In Wisconsin, it was Foxconn. I could spend the entire conversation this morning talking about Foxconn and how Wisconsin basically got outfoxed and conned by Foxconn. You also have the classic example of Alabama and South Carolina going after that Mercedes-Benz plan, and kind of the gamemanship towards the end that it was getting kind of silly what Alabama and South Carolina were throwing on the table. Most recently, Amazon, when its announcement for a second headquarters, it basically put out said, okay, we're open to bribes. And it was, I believe, a 16-page call for proposals to basically say, okay, what are you going to give us to locate our second headquarters in your place? And it almost got into a feeding frenzy. Now, this current thinking about the way we think about economic development in terms of trying to go after manufacturing plants and big firms can kind of be traced back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture Industrial Act. Mississippi during the Great Depression was an agricultural economy, and they were desperately trying to diversify their economy and to grow their economy. And what they looked at is they looked at a lot of the manufacturing firms that were in kind of what's now referred to as the Rust Belt. And what they were trying to do was to say, hey, look at us, think about moving, picking up and relocating and moving to Mississippi. And the idea is that we have a positive business climate, and that business climate revolves around cheap labor, cheap land, limited regulations, and limited taxes. Okay. That was their selling card. That's what they were trying to promote. Today, when I teach my class, I ask people, and sometimes in my extension setting, I will ask people, what do you think of when you think of a positive business climate? These are the types of things that immediately pop to people's mind. It's always kind of in the background in terms of people thinking about economic development strategies. This was really the first fire in the new war between the states. And it essentially kind of laid down the gauntlet, and a lot of places have followed up with that. So the first wave of economic development thinking really is kind of this industrial recruitment with kind of a focus on manufacturing. Remember the time the engine of economic growth was manufacturing, and that's where a lot of the attention was placed. Okay, the idea that was driven home is that a positive business climate requires cheap labor. In other words, unions are bad. Cheap labor, low taxes, and limited regulations. If we do these things, we have a positive business climate, and good things will happen. Businesses will want to move here. Okay, I grabbed these statements from various state economic development agencies about 2 weeks ago. These are some of the phrases that you see in all these various state, this is Texas, the best business climates in the nation, one of the lowest overall tax burdens in the country, $4 billion in tax relief for businesses, right to work. That's anti-union, okay? North Carolina, same type of thing. Our state has the lowest corporate tax rate in the country. Business costs rank amongst the lowest in the countries. There's less red tape and litigation. All of these kind of flow from that idea of what is a positive business climate. Florida, it's a pro-business state, tax policies, competitive costs of doing business, streamlined regulatory environment, right to work, no personal income tax. Again, it's the same things being emphasized again and again. Tennessee, right to work, no personal income tax, Local tax burdens among the lowest in the country. Tort and worker compensation laws. Okay, again, not only is it a regulatory environment, but our ability to sue for bad practices is limited as well. Idaho, we keep our costs and taxes low. We remove the burdensome regulations. That's the way that a lot of states are thinking about economic development. And it all goes back to this first wave of industrial recruitment and the focus on manufacturing. Big firms got the attention. What was good for General Motors is good for America. So we only focus on big businesses. Tax incentives. We throw money at businesses to move to your state. Okay. Foxconn, when Foxconn was saying, we were looking at $3 billion to get Foxconn to move to Wisconsin. Foxconn, where they were thinking of building this thing, is basically a huge vacant lot. They didn't do anything. Public dollars invested in infrastructure. This is Cynthia Rogers' Fellows address the other day, was talking about this type of thing in with TIFs in Norman, Oklahoma. Same type of idea, okay? Then slowly the first wave kind of got replaced by the second wave, and it's a focus on small businesses. Essentially, David Birch in the late 1970s, early 1980s, found that there's some really strong evidence that it's not so much what's good for GM is good for America. It's more small businesses are the source of economic growth. More recent work suggests that it's not just small businesses, it's newer businesses, it's startup businesses. Indeed, if you look at job growth can come from two places. One is existing businesses, okay, or new business startups. Well, with existing businesses, they can either, stagnate, they're not growing, they're not declining, or they're adding jobs, they're growing, or they're stagnating, they're declining, they're laying people off, or they're even closing. So to get an idea of how existing businesses add to the job picture of the U.S. is you have to look at that net job change. Add new added jobs, subtract off lost jobs. And throughout the last several decades for the U.S., net jobs from existing businesses has been negative. All the positive job growth that's occurring in the US is coming from new business formation. Okay. Local economic development and practitioners started to realize that we need to shift away from looking at just the big businesses, but to kind of start looking at these smaller businesses. Okay. For example, the Green Bay, Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce, this is their statement of purpose, kind of what they want to do. And notice the 3 bullet points here. They want to growth and expansion of existing businesses. This is business retention and expansion. And I can't help but thinking of George Morse, who just recently passed away, and his influence on how extension in particular started promoting business retention and expansion as an economic development strategy. The creation of new firms, entrepreneurial behavior. Okay, we need to focus not only on the existing businesses that we have, but we got to start focusing on new business startups. Okay, they also want to be prepared for external firms to move into the area. A lot of communities are realizing that, hey, we do still have some firms that want to move in. We need to be ready to work with them when they come knocking on our door. But we're coming to the realization that spending time for Wisconsin is basically cold calling in Chicago or cold calling in the Twin Cities is not a very good use of their time. But they'll be ready if someone comes and knocks on the door and says, hey, we're thinking of moving into your area. Okay. So the other thing that happened is that we saw a shift from a goods producing economy to a service producing economy. This was a real eye opener for a lot of economic development folks, was Citibank. And their movement of basically their Visa and MasterCard operations out of Manhattan, Wall Street, and moving it to South Dakota. What Citibank was doing is they were kind of the first to introduce Visa and MasterCard. And when they started that, they kind of needed that cluster effect of being in the Wall Street area. But once they got it up and running, they needed to lower their costs because the cost of operating in the Wall Street area is so sky high. They picked up and moved to South Dakota. And that was a real eye opener for a lot of economic development practitioners. We need to shift away from simply the goods producing and start focusing on services. This is where a lot of communities started to embrace tourism and recreation as an economic development strategy. Okay. The third wave kind of focuses on public-private partnerships and our clusters. This is almost essentially due single-handedly to Porter and his reintroduction of the notion of clusters. I can remember when Porter's clusters first came out, several of us, and I can remember several times at the Southern Regional Science Association, we would all be sitting around saying, Porter has not introduced a single new idea. He's simply taken existing ideas and repackaged them. But his impact has been that the Economic Development Administration out of the US Department of Commerce embraced Porter's ideas. When EDA embraced Porter's ideas and started weaving it throughout their programming, that had an immediate effect on how state and local governments thought about economic development. Okay. Now, the focus was to limit your resources. If you have limited resources to pursue economic growth and development. So what you should focus those limited resources on are clusters with an eye towards new and emerging clusters. And a lot of those clusters are essentially identifying those clusters that are already in your backyard, that are already in your community. And if they're there for a reason, and what can we do to help kind of make those businesses more profitable, more innovative, and what might be the next cluster on the horizon that we might be thinking about, okay? There's a key, networking is key to the dynamics. This is one of the things that started to come out from a lot of these discussions around clusters and whatnot, is that it's not just geographically closely located, but it's kind of the ability of these competing firms, input suppliers, to kind of facilitate networking. Okay, because it's that external economies of scale, that facilitation of networking and the flow of information that led to higher levels of profitability and higher levels of innovation. Okay, this is where a lot of the public-private partnerships started to come into play, is how can we as a public entity help facilitate that kind of clustering? Okay, so invest in public institutions that can support the cluster. Okay, and there's numerous examples, and several of you have written on this extensively from a perspective of perhaps your own state or your own region. Okay, here are some examples. This is directly out of Porter's website, his working group, identifying some. This is the location of cheese plants. We wear our cheese head badge very proudly. We have a lot of cheese in the state. When you think about wineries, for example, people generally think of California, Napa Valley, north of San Francisco, but increasingly there's more and more wineries that are starting to pop up. Okay. And is this flowing out of the local foods movement? Maybe. Is it flowing out of increasing taste and preferences, higher income levels? Perhaps. But we're seeing in Wisconsin, a lot of states looking at how can we build on this new emerging set of clusters. In Wisconsin, we're looking at wine and cheese trails. Come to the driftless part of Wisconsin, which is the southwestern part of the state. It's fairly hilly. It kind of reminds you a little bit of the Ozarks. And we get a lot of people, weekend trips coming up from Chicago, the Twin Cities. How can we get them here? Well, wine and cheese trails. Take advantage of all the new artisan cheese plants popping up. Take advantage of all the wineries popping up. A lot of those small local breweries want to get in on that. How can we get in on that? One of the economic development strategies is how can we facilitate that and get that working, okay? Viable clusters are more than just businesses interconnected through geographically grouped supply chains, okay? That's kind of the sterile, almost input-output type perspective on it. There are strong notions of social capital here. It's that flow of information, the trust in that flow of information, okay? People started to kind of, as they were thinking about this, they started to realize that, you start thinking about this networking, social capital, you almost need to start thinking about a systems thinking approach here. Okay. The other big thing, before I go on to that, the other big thing with the clusters, I think the lasting impact from a practical perspective that Porter's had is this regional perspective. We have seen an explosion of communities across Wisconsin that are now realizing that they're not operating in isolation. This notion of competition against your neighboring communities. Yeah, we're so competitive with them in high school basketball and whatnot. But from an economic perspective, we're seeing tremendous growth in regional approaches to thinking about economic development. And that has further kind of gotten people thinking that, there's a lot of subtleness going on here. And a lot of that subtleness is being talked about through the lens of social capital. Okay. Now, that subtleness is, folks are starting to say, we need to start thinking about this in a systems approach. Now, there are two systems approaches out there. There's lots and lots of them, but there are two that are kind of in the community development literature. One is the Schaefer Star, which Dave Marcoullier and I helped Ron kind of develop before he passed. The other is the Flores Community Capitals. I would like to say that the Schaefer Star is the one that's really having a major impact, but it's not. It's the Flores Community Capitals. That kind of framework, communities they can latch onto that idea. They can kind of latch onto, that there's multiple pieces to the puzzle of a vibrant community. It's not just built capital, in the terms of infrastructure and things like that, or natural capital in terms of amenities, or human capital in terms of the labor force, if you will, or the leadership within the community. It's social capital. It's all of these different things need to come together. And a lot of communities have embraced that. Okay. Now, the other thing that's been happening here is this kind of shift in thinking around, do people follow jobs or do jobs follow people? This is a question that regional economists have been talking about for decades. And it's a question that has Carlino Mills gets kind of the credit for it, but it actually goes back before them in terms of asking this question. And what I wanted to do was to kind of look at how this relationship has changed over time. Has it changed over time? And if it does, if this relationship has changed, then it really has a huge fundamental impact on how we approach community economic development. So I won't go through the details here. I think this is probably familiar to most of you. But what I did is I took 5-year intervals back to 1970 up to 2019. Okay. And these are the key parameters that go back to the alpha 2 and the beta 2 here and their relationship. And what throughout this time period, this is a simple OLS I didn't include any control variables here. And over this entire time period, notice that jobs tend to follow people. And it's a fairly consistent finding. And indeed, as we get closer, to the current time period, the kind of people follow jobs effect, it's still there, but it's getting weaker and well, not weaker, it's getting smaller relative to the jobs follow people effect. Okay. Now, I added some control variables. I'd have to go back and look at exactly what I included here, but the effect remains. And it's getting stronger. That people follow jobs effect, that blue chart there, that blue line, is getting weaker over time. Okay. Now, just as kind of a robustness check, I also estimated this as a system of seemingly unrelated regressions. Same effect. Now, this is with controls, the most recent time period, the relationship flipped. And I'm not going to put too much weight on that. I'm almost going to treat that as an outlier. But what's happening here is over all the time periods, jobs follow people. Now, what this means, okay, what this means is that people are starting to think about how do we approach economic development through a very, very different lens, okay? Where simply communities are shifting away from a jobs view of economic development, okay? Focus on business, recruitment, existing businesses, entrepreneurship. That's our focus. They're slowly shifting to maybe we should be focusing our attention on people instead, okay? You think on surface it's a subtle change, but it's really not. What they're realizing is that increasingly jobs follow people, okay? As we enter a systems thinking approach to economic, essentially what we're doing is we're entering a systems thinking approach, okay? And that's what I'm thinking is kind of the fourth wave of economic development. We move beyond simply focusing on jobs, businesses, to a more kind of holistic approach, if you will. And the Flores Community Capitals has allowed that to happen. This was a light bulb for me. I did a paper with John Halstead, well, a number of years ago. We were looking at, we were interested in infrastructure and small rural manufacturing. We were looking at Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And we were trying to find out, the importance of access to air freight transportation, access to rails, access to roads, all that kind of traditional stuff. And we kind of included some quality of life measures. And this is something, this is an old paper survey. And someone wrote in the margin, find an area that you want to live, then start your business. That just was like a 2x4 upside the head for me, was that particular comment. And throughout that survey, what we were finding is that, oh yeah, you want to give us tax credits? Sure, we'll take them, but it's not as important as the quality of life of the community. Where do I want to live? Where do I want to raise my family? Those types of factors are raising to the top. And the results of that survey kind of shifted the direction of a lot of my research, okay? Henry, Barkley, and Bode, their work on South Carolina urban areas. This is their Journal of Regional Science paper. I still teach this paper in my class. I mean, it's how old? And I still think it's a classic, okay? And what they found was evidence of both spread and backwash effect between urban centers and the surrounding hinterland. But what they found is that quality of life drives the results, okay? It's not so much taxes. It's not so much this other stuff. It's simply quality of life drives it. Indeed, Amanda presented a paper yesterday that was using a robotic approach to measure quality of life and population growth. And she was comparing kind of quality of life that's associated with people as opposed to kind of business factors. And she found consistently it's quality of life is what's driving it. Okay. There are other papers that have been presented in these conferences, in this conference, that kind of points to the same thing. Okay. Placemaking as an economic development strategy. This is a term that is starting to get more and more exposure and greater popularity. Okay, it's kind of like business retention and expansion. All the economic development directors and even elected officials kind of knew what business retention and expansion was. It's getting to the point now that that same group of folks are starting to understand placemaking. Okay, so what do we mean by placemaking? Placemaking essentially is, in a nutshell, is we want to make this a good a place to live as possible so that people want to live here. If we get people to move to our community, then good things will happen. Okay, it appears subtle, but it's actually quite fundamental. Okay. Now, should this fourth wave be top down or bottom up? And what I mean by this is that is this something that a state government should kind of start imposing in terms of state policies, or should it be bottom up? Should it be community driven? I'm going to argue that no, it's probably best bottom up. It's really should be driven by local initiatives the state has other comparative advantages in its disposal. The state can help facilitate public-private partnerships. The state can help provide technical expertise and maybe some grant money, but it's really got to be a bottom-up approach. Why? Because the characteristics of communities vary. Okay, what works in one community isn't going to work in another one, or may not work. Okay, and then the objectives of the desires of the communities are going to be different. Some small rural communities, they want to grow, they want to get bigger. Others say we just want to be stable. Okay, that's what we want. We just want to be stable. Okay, the problem though is that we keep going back to jobs, jobs, jobs. There's a great John Oliver has this great bit on it kind of came out of the Amazon 2 headquarters debate about jobs, jobs, jobs. The problem, this is my frustration, is that we keep going back to this notion of jobs, jobs, jobs. These are quotes that I grabbed last month that are coming from, a person announcing running for Arizona governor, jobs, jobs, jobs. The mayor of London running for second terms, jobs, jobs, jobs. The prime minister of Canada, jobs, jobs, jobs. Okay. We keep going back to this idea of, from the top down, we're focusing on jobs. That's the signal being sent at the higher levels of government, at the higher level of politics. Okay. So why do we keep going back to smokestack chasing? Okay, we see it in Wisconsin with Foxconn. This is the Brewers Stadium that was rebuilt a couple of years ago, and the Brewers, the baseball team in Milwaukee, basically said, build us a new stadium or we're going to leave. How many professional sports teams have done that? Well, having been born and raised in the Chicagoland area, I grew up a Cubs fan, so I could really care less about the Brewers. Okay, and I really didn't like the idea of my tax dollars going to build the Brewers a new stadium. I did have a chance to go to the old Brewer Stadium and watch a game. It was an embarrassment. They really needed a new stadium. I kind of haven't gone to that game and seeing how bad that stadium is. I kind of said, yeah, okay, we need a new stadium. But it was not an economic growth argument. Tommy Thompson, who was governor at the time, was arguing we need to impose these taxes to do this because it's a driver of economic growth. Not really. It's a quality of life component. Okay, it helps having the brewers there helps the quality of life within the Milwaukee metro area. In that regard, yeah, okay, I get it. Okay. But that's that shift of mentality. It's not jobs, jobs, jobs. It's how can we make this a better place to live? Okay. And this investment is worth it. Okay. Now, why do we keep going back to it? Institutional location theory. Large firms have an outside leverage. Amazon coming in and basically issuing a 16-page, okay, we're open to bribes. Who's going to give us the biggest bribe? Here are 16 pages of guidelines for what we're looking for in our bribe to come to you. Okay. Large firms can do that. Foxconn was big enough that they could kind of dangle that carrot. Mercedes playing South Carolina and Alabama off each other, they were big enough that they could do that. Okay. The problem though is that it's almost like playing a poker game where the company has all the cards close to their chest and you're playing with your cards stacked to the front of your forehead facing outward. Okay. It's not a fair game. And large companies will play this game, much like the Brewers and professional sports teams. Okay. Does Moltach's growth machine theory come into play here? Yeah, it does. Who's the power brokers? Who's going to benefit the most from old style economic development? It's the landowners. It's the property owners. Okay. They're looking at short-term returns and they're driving a lot of these conversations. They're the ones sitting at the table. Peter Eisinger wrote a very good book called The Rise of the Entrepreneurial State in 1988. And he basically was arguing, oops, I need to turn the timer off on this thing. Basically congratulating states that they were shifting away from the first wave of recruitment to focusing on entrepreneurship, business retention and expansion. And Peter was like, yeah, good, much more sustainable, much more vibrant. Just there's a much better way. About 10 years later, he wrote a follow-up piece. Essentially, I don't remember the exact title, and I don't remember the exact year. It's the demise of the entrepreneurial state. He basically said that state governments have abandoned the entrepreneurial approach, business retention and expansion. It went back to recruitment. Now, what he argued is that policymakers, particularly at the state level, and we're not even talking about the federal level, have very high discount rates. Okay. And the reason they have very high discount rates is because they're looking at the next election cycle. Okay. They're looking at what can they do that they can point to when they're running for reelection. And things like Foxconn and big ticket items, the shiny object, draws that media attention. I sometimes joke when I talk to reporters about things like Foxconn and whatnot. I kind of joke with them and say, "Hey, you're the fault. You're the reason why we continue to go back to these things." And they go, "Well, why is that?" I said, "Well, think about it. If a company comes in, moves into a community, and employs 100 new people, right? It'll probably get attention in the media, right?" Yeah. I said, okay, now what if you've got 50 small firms in your community and all 50 hire 2 new employees? You get 100 new jobs. Does that get any attention in the newspaper? No. What are the politicians going after? They're going after that positive news coverage. Okay. At the local level, people have a much lower discount rate because they're looking at what can we do to make this a better place for our children and our grandchildren. Okay. So that high discount rate in terms of trying to get reelected is driving states back to kind of this old way of thinking about economic development, the shiny thing. We can throw money at it, and then I can point to it when I run for reelection. Okay. But I keep going back to this quote. I wish I could find the survey instruments, and I wish I could track this person down, because I think this is fundamental to how we go about thinking about it moving forward. Okay. So what communities are looking at now is they want to invest in good schools, not necessarily to feed the labor force, but rather to be attracted to families with children. We want good schools so that people want to move here and send their kids to our schools because we have good schools. Public safety. Do I feel safe walking my dog at midnight? Okay. Parks, recreation, libraries, these types of things that increase the quality of life within the community. Okay. Public safety, schools, park and recs, those are all the types of things that Barkley and Henry and Bow were looking at in their South Carolina work. Okay. These are the types of things that people are looking at now. Community fairs, festivals, art in the park, farmers markets. As an economist, it's really hard to quantify the economic impact of these things on communities. But if you take a systems approach, look at this thing, you can see how it may not have a direct effect. It may not even have a first round indirect effect, but it has a third round indirect effect. And business and communities are starting to realize that. Viable local business organizations, including professional development or opportunities for local businesses. That's kind of the second wave, okay, or even the third wave. But it kind of still fits in here because businesses feel as though they're part of the community. They're part of a dynamic community. Okay, so it's an older strategy, but it's seen through a new lens. Free public Wi-Fi. Simple things like that. Tessa and I are doing a lot of work on broadband right now, and it's if COVID has taught us anything, it's that a modern economy cannot survive if you don't have access to broadband. I mean, look at the conference right now. Active volunteer organizations, okay, early childhood education, and again, not early childhood education is not necessarily so that we can produce better workers for the labor force, but rather this is creating a community where young professionals feel as though they can continue their professional career and have their children taken care of properly. Okay, creating a network opportunities for small business owners, those interested in starting a business. This is be open and receptive to newcomers to the community. Some of the work that I've been doing with John Halstead on social capital is looking at the difference between bridging and bonding social capital. Bonding social capital means there's pretty strong ties within the community. Bridging social capital means that you're connected to outside. Okay, the Porter with the clusters has got more folks realizing that, hey, we need to have stronger bridging social capital networks, connections with our neighboring communities within the region. But are people within the community really receptive to those ideas from outside the community? Okay, that kind of, you're not from here, so you don't understand. How do we get away from that type of stuff? Okay, there's some work being done by some sociologists out of Iowa State University, this Iowa Small Towns Project that's been looking at this kind of stuff. And it's just, I think they're onto something. Okay, different ways of thinking. Oh, do strategies that flow from these different ways of thinking replace the waves that come before? And I'll thank Judy Stallman for this, because she kind of really challenged me to think about this. And I'd say no. Rather than reorientation, rather it's a reorientation of our thinking. Okay, we're refocusing our strategies through a different lens. Okay, we're still investing in schools, but for a slightly different rationale. Okay, we're thinking in broader terms, we're broadening our perspectives. So really, I would say that it's almost like enveloping. It's almost like maybe waves is not the right term, because waves kind of say, you know, one comes in and then the next one comes in and the next one comes in. It's really more kind of encompassing. Community should still be thinking about recruitment when a business comes and knocks on their door. They're ready to respond. Okay. They're still thinking about entrepreneurship and business retention and expansion and focusing on the businesses that are already there. They're thinking about how can we build better networking opportunities? How can we build a greater sense of social capital, if you will? Okay. And then fourth one now is that why let's kind of bring in why people would want to live here. And that broadening that perspective out, I think really kind of opens the door for a lot more innovative ways for communities. Now, in Wisconsin, one thing that is, and I'll stop with this, the one thing that is drawing a lot of attention, and this is something that Heather Stevens and I have been thinking about, is telecommuting. When COVID first hit, as I talked with reporters and whatnot, COVID's going to change the world and change how we do everything. It's like, no, we have a very short memory. Once we kind of get the vaccine and we get herd mentality and COVID's in the history books, we'll have forgotten about it. We'll go back to where we were. I think that's not quite true. And I think it's this notion of telecommuting. This notion that businesses are starting to rethink, why do we have these big, expensive office footprints when we don't need them? Maybe what we could do is downscale our offices and people can telecommute. If that's the case, a growing number of workers become more footloose, and they're going to be looking for alternatives. So this fourth wave of economic development really kind of comes into play when you start thinking about telecommuting and how communities can position themselves to be more attractive to folks that want to telecommute now and pick up and move into a different area. I'm going to stop with that. And I think I've got about 5 minutes left. Got a couple of minutes left. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions?
So Steve, this is Krista Cord. I have a question too.
Please, Krista.
Go ahead, Krista.
Okay. So Steve, I think that you are well aware that I've been a big fan for the last couple of years, and I'm very happy that you are a fellow this year. So congratulations before
Thank
I
you.
move on. I am really excited to see the systems thinking aspect of this, and especially systems thinking in the sense of thinking about the systems, not just, you know, measuring a system or modeling a system. And you know, I had written about that in the review that I did for the 50th anniversary of the RRS, not more broadly about regional science, but I really like the application of it here specifically to economic development. So I just wanted to make sure that that was heard and that you and I need to talk, because I have all kinds of ideas. One of our extension programs here is training others in systems thinking, just broadly and generally. And one of the groups that we are aiming to train is our county commissioners here in Florida. So I think that making others recognize, not just us as regional scientists, recognize that systems thinking is the way to approach this, through which, you know, one of the lenses that we should use to be approaching these things, but also making sure that the other side is receptive and able to think in a similar way so that they can see the benefits, I think is a really important aspect of this.
I've been that Florida's community capitals. Part of me is like, well, rats, I wanted the Schaefer Star to take the center stage. But Neil Flores, a sociologist, so there's always that kind of disciplinary rivalry there. But I think they've hit on something there. And the reason they hit on something is because it's simple. You can go to a county commissioner and walk them through that, and they get it. They understand it. If you go back and you look at, you know, kind of the theoretical systems thinking, and you look at some of the diagrams that come out of the more complex systems thinking, it doesn't really help. It looks like an explosion in a lumber yard. I mean, I look at it and it's just like I glaze over. So there's beauty in simplicity. And it opens the door for more in-depth conversations. Thank you, Kristen.
And I usually function through, well, I use information from the Cabrera Research Lab, and I was glad to hear your comments on Porter, that some or a lot of what he has done is just repackaging other things in a way that was consumable outside of regional science or outside of economics. And I think the Cabreras have done a good job and a similar job of just repackaging systems thinking in a more simple way. So yeah, thanks. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Heather?
Well, I was just going to say, and I don't want to keep us delayed because you and I can talk later on, but I think that what you were pointing out, this kind of focus on education and community kind of assets, has been sort of highlighted in a new initiative here in West Virginia. And we have a remote worker initiative. And the intention of it was to bring people to communities in West Virginia that maybe aren't doing well. And yet, interestingly, the first 3 communities chosen are all places that are, I would say, doing better than most of the other communities, including Morgantown. And I think that they've found through this project that they have to be able to market places with better schools and more amenities. And so it's going to be a while before they can start rolling it out in communities that are at most need of new infusions. So it's going to be this chicken and an egg thing. You know, distressed regions are going to want to look at this, but they don't have the assets. Then they can't really roll out that kind of program.
It's almost like, let's be strategic here. Let's find a couple of communities where we think this thing will work. It does work. And then you kind of, other communities kind of look at that and say, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. What did they do that was so successful? And how can we learn from that? So it is, it could be a strategic way to go about, let's kind of beta test this thing. kind of stack the deck, if you will, so that it works. And then we can roll it out further. Now that would be, good for West Virginia, or it could be Moltock's growth machine theory coming in and basically saying that those 4 or 5 cities have the political power base to get the resources there. That's the
Or-
skeptic. That's the skeptic in me. That's the
Or
glass half
already
empty.
had the resources, and
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge, I think. So I think that's going to be the challenge with this thing is there's still going to be the haves and have-nots, and that's going to be the things that we're going to have to think about going forward.
It almost goes, I mean, there was, oh God, his name just slipped out of my mind. Mark Lapping, who's a planner, introduced this idea of triage. Not all communities can be saved. Should we waste limited resources trying to save all communities? From a cold-hearted economist perspective, that makes a hell of a lot of sense, but it's pretty cold-hearted. But it does raise the question of that there's some places are just not going to survive. They're going to continue to lag behind. And that's a tough call.
It is. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, are there any more questions? If not, the next round of sessions starts in about 9 minutes. Thank you for attending. And again, congratulations, Steve. Thank you for working with us.
Thank you for the honor.
Take care.